Choosing a qualitative approach is not about selecting a methodological label that sounds appropriate. It is about aligning your research question with the kind of understanding you are trying to produce. The approach follows the structure of the question and the type of knowledge required. In this context, listening refers to analytic orientation rather than interview technique. It refers to what you are treating as primary in your study and what you are committing to examine systematically in your analysis. Listening means deciding what will count as significant when you interpret your data. Different qualitative approaches emphasize different analytic focal points. Some prioritize how participants perceive and interpret a phenomenon. Some prioritize how something unfolds over time. Some prioritize how experiences are constructed into narrative. Some prioritize how a phenomenon operates within a particular setting. Each orientation carries assumptions about how knowledge is generated. Some assume meaning is constructed through interpretation and reflection. Some assume understanding emerges through examining interaction and development. Some assume identity is shaped through narrative construction. Some assume phenomena are shaped by structural and contextual conditions. Approach selection therefore reflects not only topic focus, but how you believe understanding is built. When your question centers how participants perceive, interpret, or make meaning of a phenomenon, you are prioritizing perception and interpretation. This does not automatically make a study phenomenological. Many qualitative traditions examine perception and meaning. What distinguishes formal phenomenology are its specific analytic commitments to identifying shared meaning structures and essence, not simply the presence of experience language. In perception-oriented work, the unit of analysis is the structure of meaning. The analytic task is to identify patterns in how participants understand and interpret the phenomenon, as well as points of divergence. Claims emerging from this orientation concern how participants conceptualize, describe, and experience the phenomenon. For example, how do learners with dyslexia interpret their sense of independence when using AI tools? A defensible claim from this study might be, participants described independence primarily as the absence of adult mediation rather than the presence of internal strategy use. When your question centers how something develops, changes, or unfolds over time, you are prioritizing process. Process-oriented studies examine sequences, interactions, phases, and turning points that contribute to change. In process-oriented work, the unit of analysis is the unfolding sequence of actions or interactions. The analytic task is to identify stages, mechanisms, and conditions that shape development. Claims emerging from this orientation concern how change occurs and under what conditions. For example, how do learners develop self-initiated engagement over the course of a semester when AI scaffolds are introduced? A defensible claim from this study might be, independent engagement developed through 3 identifiable phases: initial reliance on prompts, transitional experimentation, and sustained autonomous initiation. When your question centers how participants construct and tell their experiences, you are prioritizing story. Story-oriented studies examine how events are organized into narratives, how identities are shaped through storytelling, and how meaning is structured across time. In story-oriented work, the unit of analysis is narrative construction. The analytic task is to examine plot structure, temporality, identity positioning, and the language participants use to frame change. Claims emerging from this orientation concern how individuals construct identity and meaning through narrative form. For example, how do learners narrate their journey from dependence to autonomy in academic settings? A defensible claim from this study might be, participants constructed autonomy as a turning point narrative, marking a shift from externally defined competence to internally claimed capability. When your question centers how a phenomenon operates within a specific environment, you are prioritizing context. Context-oriented studies examine bounded systems such as classrooms, programs, organizations, or communities in depth. In context-oriented work, the unit of analysis is the bounded system itself. The analytic task is to examine relationships, structures, policies, and interactions that shape the phenomenon within that defined setting. Claims emerging from this orientation concern how system dynamics influence outcomes. For example, how does the introduction of AI tools reshape independence within a specific inclusive high school program? A defensible claim from this study might be, independence was shaped less by the technology itself, and more by how teachers structured its integration within classroom routines. These focal points describe analytic commitments rather than rigid categories. They clarify what you are treating as primary in your design. A single project may include multiple emphases, but one typically anchors the structure of sampling, data collection, and analysis. Certain qualitative traditions often align with these emphases. Questions centered on perception and meaning frequently align with phenomenological traditions. Questions centered on unfolding action often align with grounded theory traditions. Questions centered on narrative construction align with narrative inquiry. Questions centered on bounded systems align with case study traditions. These alignments reflect analytic commitments, not simply terminology. A helpful diagnostic question is, what must I understand to answer this research question? If the answer is how participants interpret and make meaning, perception and interpretation are central. If the answer is how something develops across time or interaction, process is central. If the answer is how experiences are constructed into identity narratives, story is central. If the answer is how structures and relationships within a defined setting shape the phenomenon, context is central. These analytic commitments influence sampling decisions. A process-focused study may require longitudinal engagement to observe development. A context-focused study may require sampling multiple roles within a system. A story-focused study may require extended narrative interviews. A perception-focused study may require depth interviews that allow for reflective meaning-making. They also influence analysis. Process-oriented analysis looks for stages, phases, turning points, and mechanisms. Story-oriented analysis examines plot structure, identity positioning, and temporal framing. Context-oriented analysis examines system relationships, conditions, and constraints. Perception-oriented analysis examines shared meaning structures and variation in interpretation. Misalignment becomes visible when the stated approach does not match the structure of the research question. If a study claims to be a case study but does not center a bounded system, analytic criteria become unclear. If a study claims phenomenology, but the analysis primarily examines institutional policy rather than participant interpretation, coherence weakens. A common near-miss occurs when researchers ask a process question, but collect data at only one time point. Without longitudinal or sequential data, it becomes difficult to make defensible claims about development or unfolding change. Similarly, if a researcher claims narrative inquiry, but treats interviews as repositories of themes rather than analyzing narrative structure and identity construction, the analytic commitment does not match the label. The research question should clarify what must be understood. The qualitative approach gives structure to that focus. Listening in this sense means deciding what counts as analytically significant during interpretation. Sometimes researchers intentionally integrate emphases. A study may examine perception within a bounded case. A project may trace process through narrative accounts. When this occurs, the integration must be explicit and supported by analytic depth in each orientation rather than surface-level borrowing of terminology. Selecting a qualitative approach is therefore an act of structural alignment. It requires clarity about what the study seeks to understand, discipline in organizing design decisions accordingly, and consistency between the claims made and the analytic commitments chosen. When analytic emphasis, research question, sampling, data collection, and analysis are aligned, the qualitative design becomes structurally coherent. Listening for perception, process, story, or context ensures that the chosen approach reflects the kind of knowledge the research problem requires rather than the appeal of a particular methodological label.